This is a text-to-speech presentation. The original one was in Hungarian language. The text-to-speech software was from imtranslator.com.
Let me welcome the attendants of our club day. This is the first occasion where we explore a little bit the challenges of permission handling from the point of view as it usually occurs in practice. What is the security aspect of it and what is the business aspect of it? Where are the overlaps? How are responsibilities split? Where are the possible misunderstandings in this area that we could observe in the industry? I asked Mr. Rago to deliver the keynote speech. I know about him that he deals with security topics of his systems on a leadership level for several years now. Currently he is the Chief Security Officer of Erste Bank, and I also know about him that he has the necessary insight related to the business challenges of his systems. I thank him very much for accepting the invitation. Participants are welcome to raise their hands anytime, either in real life or virtually, so that we can make this discussion interactive. Those who listen to it later will have the opportunity to raise their questions in a forum published for this purpose. After this presentation, Zoltán Tánczos Jr. will talk about Dealogic's viewpoint related to this topic. This can be done in the most efficient way using our product TCPS. Now I'll hand over to Mr. István Rago, Chief Security Officer of Erste Bank.
Thank you for the introduction and greeting. In the keynote presentation I'd like to share some provoking thoughts with the distinguished audience. A few minutes ago I looked at my opening slide and I thought the title should be changed up front. Maybe it would be too large a task to deal with the general challenges of permission handling. I'd like to briefly share a few thoughts about some challenges of permission handling. I'd like to encourage everybody to share their reaction later on. Obviously, I'm open for all these kinds of professional discussions. I'd like to approach the matter of permission handling from two directions. The first one is more a technological point of view, and the second one is a business approach. Without giving a full historical overview, let me tell you that earlier the era of insular applications had the following characteristic: each application, each system implemented and handled its own authentication and authorization. As a consequence, these had to be maintained separately, permission rules had to be formulated separately. If somebody wanted to find out all of a particular user's permissions in the organization, separate queries were needed, and it required a relatively lengthy procedure to revoke or modify those when needed. Architecturally this means significant redundancies, and with regards to processes it resulted in lengthy manual processes. Then the world has changed. The architecture has changed, and the industry reacted quickly. User authentication can be outsourced quickly and easily from individual applications and it has to be made available as a central service. This made the execution of different security-type processes easier. For example, a password change has to be performed in one place only. If the organization wants to ban somebody for some reason, it can be done at a single point. However, in this architecture it is still an internal decision of each individual application, who is entitled to perform what operation. The following slide shows that it's a little unsure where we are really now regarding this topic. In reality we talk about the near future here, but we already see solutions where we can talk present tense. The next step in this development is to outsource not only the authentication but also the authorization. The authorization will be served by an external engine. This way the real permission decisions will not be made one by one within the applications. The decision should be made by a permission engine. This way the permission rules related to a user could be maintained in one single point. Let's admit that for the business it isn't interesting at all how a system's permission management looks like technically. This is not their specialty area. However, for them it is important what the authorization really means. Very concisely, without a sophisticated scientific formulation, it means to define what functions a given user is allowed to perform. The function means very simple functions for old IT people: create something, approve something, or delete something. When we look only at these functions and start to discuss with the business area, they will formulate many more requirements in connection with a function or a process. If we say that a user is allowed to create a new customer record, the business quickly comes up with the requirement, yes, okay, but only the creation of a certain type of customer is allowed for that user. So for example, a retail agent is not allowed to create enterprise customers and vice versa. If a given function depends upon a specific data domain, that means immediate basic added business value for the business. So they regard it as a business requirement. Another question is whether the user is allowed to create clients only in a given branch or in any branch. For example, the fact whether a user can query only his own data domain or the competing branch's data domain too. This may directly determine the business processes, and causes differences in the reporting system too. So the data domain is a very important element of the whole permissioning rule, and this can be defined only by the business side. It is not an IT or a security task. In effect, the business decides who is allowed to do what. A similar example is, can somebody perform a task permanently or just in a specific period, for example when replacing somebody? If we talk about modifications, yes, maybe the person has the permission to modify an interest rate, but how much can he deviate from a preset value? This depends on the person's position in the organization hierarchy, since people on different levels of the organization hierarchy have different decision authorities. Obviously, a branch manager, a regional manager, or a member of the board will be allowed to deviate from the preset default value to a different extent. This is also a criteria that needs to be taken into consideration when we are looking for answers to a question like, is a particular user entitled to perform a transaction? When we look for answers to all these questions regarding processes, we need to think about other basic expectations too. For example, auditability, transparency, and the fact that changes must be handled very quickly. In today's decisions where processes are changed, organizations are changed month by month, you need to adapt very quickly. In a system where these rules are implemented together with the individual applications, maybe even in the program code, this can be extremely difficult or even impossible to manage. An external rule engine should provide the business with flexibility. It should give the possibility to the business to define processes and responsibilities, and should provide the security department to monitor individual changes historically. It should be easy to answer who had what permissions and when. These are the few thoughts I wanted to share with you briefly, really just thought-provoking ideas, in order to stir some argument. I will stay for the other presentations and afterwards, so if there are questions, I will be available to you, and I am happy to enter in discussions about this topic.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to turn over to Zoltán Tánczos Jr. He presents SteelLogic's vision related to permission handling. Our product TCPS and the methodology have been developed in the past 9 years in order to implement this vision. I encourage everybody to ask questions and argue with us. I'm handing over.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'd like to immediately agree with István. I also think that permission handling is a huge area. I'd like to just share a few thoughts that discuss the involvement of the business people with permission handling and some thoughts about other aspects need to be taken into account besides the security aspects. In this thought-provoking presentation, I'd like to highlight two important topics. Firstly, are the authorization rules business rules or not? Secondly, as a result of this, what challenges do we need to face in case of handling large amounts of data? Let's look at it from a developer's point of view. The problem space of permission handling starts at the system design. The permission handling capabilities of the applications, that means the functions to be protected by permissions, have to be documented in the logical system design document. I am confident that by the end of my presentation it will be a little more understandable why I am saying, a change is needed in the software methodology. Progress has to be made in the definition of a function and in the relation between function and permission. I think unified methodology and unified quality assurance are very important here during the design and development. In the past and to a significant extent in the present, the real situation is that most systems still implement their own authorization, and their permission handling approaches are different. Their maintenance procedures and quality assurance procedures are different. This is a huge problem for an organization that develops several applications in parallel in multiple projects, with multiple developers. In the lack of a unified design and implementation methodology, several solutions are created in an organization. This also affects testing and audit. In contrary to this, uniformity would mean that the applications can be tested and audited according to the same methodology. Uniformity is also important with regards to operations. Here I would like to refer to what István said about authentication. There are also certain parts of authorization and IT security that were externalized quite successfully. There are standards, methodologies, packaged products built around these parts. The concept of identity management systems is a good example how part of the problem was successfully covered in a standard way. The LDAP directory solved the unified authentication and in many cases the unified handling of groups. However, it is a serious mistake to think that this would mean real externalization of the permission handling from applications. I have grouped all the ideas to be presented in the remaining part around a sample application. This is a pretty simple application in terms of functionality. We developed this tool to monitor the activities performed by our company. There is a strict hierarchy of customers, contracts and the projects belonging to the contracts. Further projects contain tasks. Our developers, operators, project managers, and team leaders are allowed to book activities to specific individual tasks. Efforts spent during the execution of tasks can be monitored based on this. So the application enables the maintenance of customers, contracts, projects, tasks, and activities. New ones can be created, existing ones can be modified and in certain cases deleted. Obviously, it must be possible to display and list the above entities, and also reports are created about actual activities summarized in various views. In order to keep the presentation short, I had to further restrict this relatively restricted circle. Going forward, I'd like to discuss just the permissions around the administration of activities. Permission handling around the activities is made exciting by the fact that the application has numerous different participants and users. The customers or companies we work for are interested to know how much work we have executed for them and when. They would like to monitor and verify the activities booked, because this is the basis for our invoicing. Project managers monitor the projects belonging to them. For developers, it is important to monitor their own activities in order to account for their work time. Team leaders are responsible for their teams. The customers are not allowed to view each other's data because they are often competitors and the data are sensitive. Referring back to István's presentation, permission cannot be handled on a function level. It does matter for which company's contract we want to list the activities. It does matter which company's contract we want to modify and book their a few thousand hours. I will present a real situation as an example. The user with the ID Zoltán is myself. I am affected by many topics in the company, including the control of other colleagues and reporting. For that I can book to all topics and I can report all activities. The user with the ID P. Molnar is a team leader in TCPS development. He is allowed to book only to this project. P. Molnar can book hours only to TCPS development, but he can also report the members of his own team in this project. Why is this limited to this project? Because the developer with the ID Applehammer, for example, works part-time in P. Molnar's team, but he also works in other projects at the same time. Team leader P. Molnar is not allowed to report these other activities. This belongs to another project manager. Let's have a look at the application. The example refers to this particular application, but the representation of the problem is totally generic. That means you can easily relate to any other application. Firstly, the user identification itself, that is the user administration, has been successfully externalized to a central element of the architecture. So the data of the users displayed in the box on the left side are external information to the application. User data are among others their role, group membership, name and geographic location of their organization unit, direct supervisor's ID, etc. Overall, user properties are external information for the Activity Monitor application. On the other hand, the internal information managed by the Activity Monitor application are those belonging to projects, tasks and activities, etc. For example, each activity belongs to a specific task, through this to a project, a contract, a customer, and it has an owner who performed the activity, start date, end date, and obviously there is a description attached. Now we can start thinking about how to implement permission handling. A simple example is to define a permission called Activity Create. This can be in a one-to-one relation with an Activity Create push button published by our application. This would be very nice and very simple this way, and it would even make little sense to externalize. But, it is not realistic from a business point of view, as István and myself repeatedly mentioned it. The data properties are decisive from a permission point of view, for which task, which contract we'd like to authorize the create permission. Our clients get information from this application too, therefore it is important to keep this data up to date. Our internal regulation is that activities have to be captured within 48 hours. This way we can tell our clients that the system contains a registry that is accurate for time periods before actual calendar date minus 48 hours. So during the authorization of the create activity function, it needs to be verified whether 48 hours have passed since the execution of the activity. But in order to correct mistakes, a permission is needed for creating or modifying retroactively too. So there will be two permissions associated with the create activity function. I left the original activity create here in the sample code, and we have defined an activity create 48 besides it. What's the problem with it? Typically the business rule itself will be hard-coded into the application. Somebody might say, 48 has to be specified as an external parameter. I have to draw your attention to a widely accepted myth. The ability to set parameters externally is far from being the same as the externalizing of business rules. Even if the application would receive 48 as a parameter, the validation logic is built into the application. The parameter 48 in itself doesn't tell us whether it should be calculated from the beginning or the end of the activity. It doesn't tell us whether we should take into consideration calendar days or work days. But this is not enough. We don't have to think very long to remember that in normal case everybody has to be able to register their own activities only. But there are users who are allowed to modify the activities of colleagues subordinated to them. The Secretariat is allowed to perform retroactive modifications after notification of the contract's owner, or based on its explicit request. Now we handle the permissions in a considerable amount of code, but this code doesn't handle the permissions on contract level at all. If we want to include this as well, then we will build such a large piece of code into the application. Moreover, the real code would be much larger, and we would be unhappy during an audit, when the question is raised, who is authorized in this application and for what? We couldn't answer this question easily even though group memberships are administered in LDAP. This piece of code isn't even able to handle the simple case with 3 users described in the introduction. The error hyperlink reference not valid development of a significant amount of code would be required. We haven't touched the problem how to store and maintain, for example, which user is allowed to book to which task or which task can be reported by whom. We haven't talked about the necessary database and how to access this information. Maybe I'll provoke a discussion, but I have to mention here that the majority of the online business applications are mainly nothing else but permission handling. Actually, the final conclusion I'd like to put up for debate is the following: when we discuss about permission handling, we can't ignore the business information, we can't ignore the data we handle, we can't ignore how to change a business rule. Let's take a simple example. We have a condition user ID has to be part of Group A. Now we have to extend this with the condition that user ID must not be part of Group C. Is this simple enough? Yes, but in this case we are going to modify the structure of the rule and not only values of parameters. Okay, my point is, if we want to be able to do this change without changing the program code, then we need new tools and methodology of a dynamic approach. The tool for this is TCPS. How does the solution look like in TCPS? We go back to the old approach, as István called it. At the point of authorization our program calls TCPS, we hand over the function identifier in the old sense, that is create activity. We are back at the representation of a function and of a permission. At the same time, we hand over to TCPS the context of the function, the whole business object for which we handle the permission. This call is a so-called is-allowed call returning true or false. The application has to execute or reject the creation of the activity accordingly. We think that TCPS provides a general and easy-to-use interface and methodology for this. We'll not be able to go into details now, but I am showing you the rule I prepared for this example. If somebody takes the time, it is easy to understand. The descriptions of individual rows of the rule help it. They formulate the objective of the given rule part in an understandable language. After reading this, the formal part is easy to follow. Let's have a look for example at the row with Zoltán. Here the only restriction refers to the user ID. So if the ID of the authenticated user is Zoltán, then he is allowed to modify within 72 hours in case of any activity owner, any contract, and any subject. In row 15 we can see that the Secretariat is allowed to modify anytime. I mentioned this earlier. In the first row we can see the base permission that each employee is allowed to perform booking within 48 hours if the activity owner is his own user, that is when he'd like to book his own activity. So, without going into detail, the essence is that we can create an arbitrary logical structure, and based on the context received from the application the rule engine can make the decision. Before evaluating the decision, TCPS is able to determine even properties that are not directly passed but can be derived from the context. I hope I managed to get the audience to think about it. Can the permission handling be limited to the maintenance of the properties in the user box on the left? I hope a little bit that your answer is no. And I also hope that you agree with me that the code sequences in the middle are strictly scope of permission handling. I think that during a security testing or audit a security officer has to seriously consider the things in the middle box too. To be honest, this kind of externalization itself can be performed even without TCPS, even if it's not so elegant. There are several rule engines and general permission handlers created for this. All of them provide some kind of easy-to-use programming facilities generally with an approach, if condition is true do this, else do that. But there are some problems where these permission externalizations fail. The externalization can fail many ways. One of the problems with the if-then-else approach is the following. The applications that operate on the data protected by permission rules are generally displaying these data on some screens or in some listings, or provide the user some screen interfaces to start search operations according to the selection criteria entered on the screen. The data are stored in relational databases nowadays, and applications are implemented the way that they issue select commands with where conditions. This is fine, but how can the if-then-else type of permissions be considered in select statements? Unfortunately they cannot. If you would have a solution for this, already tell me or write me. In this application we follow a simple principle. I think it can be applied generally. The user is allowed to list the rows he is allowed to view one by one. What do we need for this? Currently there are hundreds of thousands of activities in this application's database, and this amount is continuously increasing. The capabilities of the database itself enable us not to archive for many years to come. However, the number of rows given back by a simple select statement without considering the permission rules would be 10 to 100 times bigger. Running permission handling for this amount of data would be a challenge already. The case of the user Zoltán is simple. He is allowed to view all activities, so he needs to see in a report or on a list screen the rows marked with green. The case of P. Molnar is more complex. He is allowed to view his own team's activities performed on TCPS development. The user, Applehammer, has permissions for his own activities only. The database features a response time of a few seconds even for several millions of records, but if calling and executing of an if-then-else type of rule takes 1 millisecond only, then filtering the rows one by one for the whole database would take about 20 minutes. Another additional problem when displaying from such a large amount of data is the implementation of paging. If the user with the ID pmoliner started work exactly on March 18, 2013, then only these two activities will be displayed. So if we implement the filtering in a way that it reads the database until it finds enough rows for a page, then the database will be read to the end. And this will cause performance problems. We also need to read through the database if we want to know the total number of hits, for example in order to navigate to a page having a specific sequence number. Good news is, with TCPS we can implement the externalized permission handling. TCPS enables us to implement the filtering with one single SQL query with excellent response time. Let's have a look at how this can be done. According to my current best knowledge, this is not provided by any other engine. This requires the unique capability of TCPS that rules can be evaluated in multiple ways. Previously we asked for an is allowed evaluation of the rule. The TCPS answer to this can be yes or no. Now we request from TCPS an evaluation of type get condition to allow for the same rule. If we don't give anything else besides this to TCPS, we get back the full logical expression representing the rule. Because now, when calling TCPS the user ID pmoliner is passed, and TCPS is able to determine the logical expression that should be true for all rows that can be returned to pmoliner. We mentioned the rule called activity view. Row 15 is relevant for user pmoliner. The conditions that are left empty do not introduce any limitation, but the activity owner has to be Elxeco, Applehammer or FCOSA. And for these three users he is allowed to view only the bookings made for the task TCPS development. The first row of the rule that is practically valid for everybody is also valid for him. One single thing matters here. The activity owner must be the same as the ID of the logged-in user. Row 16 doesn't apply because the user ID is not Zoltán. Row 17 doesn't apply because he's not a member of the team leaders group. Neither does row 18, because the user ID is not the same as Coca. Here is the whole condition to be true that user pmoliner can see the activity. After removing redundancies, TCPS returns a logical expression in a form that is applicable for computer processing. TCPS returns the string you can see here in a structured form. Here we can see that the project has to be equal to TCPS development, and activity owner has to be Applehammer or Elxeco or FCOSA. Another condition connected with OR can also make the condition to be true. The activity owner has to be pmoliner. If you remember the Excel sheet, these conditions are reflecting the two rows relevant for user pmoliner. Our program can create a select statement with the appropriate where conditions fairly easily out of this. In order to transform this permission condition into a select that a program can issue, we need some metadata about the database only. If we have it, the permission conditions of a select can be prepared in the program so that the permission rules will be considered immediately. This way the query can be performed in one single database select and it takes into account the permission rule too. It retrieves from the database only those objects that the given user is allowed to view, so paging and filtering will both work. I'd like to mention that besides the is allowed and get condition to allow types of evaluation, TCPS provides another for exciting evaluation types for the rules. Each type represents key differentiator facilities of TCPS. Maybe I'll cover those in one of my future presentations. I hope you'll agree that filtering large amounts of data is an exciting challenge and it's applicable not only for permission problems. I think this is one of the most important inhibitors for the externalization of permission rules. And I'm very curious what other solutions have been created for externalizing the permission handling of large amounts of data. I'm done. I hope I managed to start a few thoughts in your heads and I'm happy to receive your questions.
Thank you for the presentation. I'd like to add that in reality when we have to create rules related to a contract or a new colleague, it's an activity of maximum a few minutes. I hope we managed to present the general concept behind the specific simple example. Basically the objective was not the presentation of the special permission handling in our activity monitor. We wanted to draw your attention to the possibility of filtering large amounts of data according to business and permission criteria. Does anybody have any contribution or comment? Thank you. If questions come up later, they can be raised using the forum published on our website. Maybe we'll continue somewhere here on our next club day. We are looking forward to receiving experts' contributions, and you can sign up for the keynote speech. Thank you for your attention.